Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a chapter of U.S. history that is, quite frankly, wild. We aren't just talking about settlers moving west in covered wagons. We're looking at the actual paper trail, the legal loopholes, and the historical reality of exactly how the early United States expanded its borders from coast to coast. It's a meticulously documented account of a new nation using bureaucracy, treaties, and the law to completely redraw its map. So let's dive right in and look at one of the most famous real estate deals in history, the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. For a mere $15 million, the U.S. struck a deal with France that supposedly doubled the country's size overnight. I mean, it sounds like the ultimate bargain, right? But what they actually bought kind of forces us to reframe how we think about land ownership back then. And this right here perfectly highlights a massive misconception. The common myth is that the U.S. bought outright ownership of the land, but honestly, France didn't even own that land to sell it. Hundreds of native tribes had been living there for thousands of years. What the U.S. actually bought were the imperial rights. Basically, France was just agreeing to step back and let the budding United States colonize the area without European interference. To actually own the land, the U.S. still had to go get it from the first Americans who literally lived there. Which brings us to this illusion of the Louisiana Purchase and how it clashed with the nation's founding ideals.
See, this illusion of ownership put the new nation at a really fascinating crossroads. The founding generation had just broken away from the old conquering empires of Europe, right? They wanted to be different. Early on, leaders like George Washington voiced a very specific ideal. He actually stated he was determined that the administration of Indian affairs be directed entirely by the great principles of justice and humanity. The whole plan was to negotiate, pay for land fairly, and sign formal, voluntary treaties, instead of just resorting to outright conquest.
But as you might guess, those treaties eventually turned into a long string of broken promises. Initially, sure, there was an attempt at fair trade, offering farming equipment, blacksmith services, cash for land. But as the U.S. population boomed and settlers just poured west, those ideals of justice evaporated pretty quickly. When tribes understandably said no thanks, we're keeping our ancestral homes, the strategy shifted. Look at this timeline. Up near the Great Lakes, tribes set a river as a border. The U.S. ignored it, went to war, lost twice, but won the third time to take Ohio. Down in Florida, military force literally pushed the Seminoles deep into the swampy interior. Over in Alabama, the Muskogee agreed to sell some land to guarantee keeping the rest, a guarantee that was violated just 4 years later. And in the Dakota Territory, a solid peace treaty with the Sioux and Arapaho shattered after only 8 years, simply because gold was discovered. It was a mix of military force, exploiting tribal divisions, and aggressive coercion. And the scale of this bureaucracy is absolutely staggering. 368. Over the course of nearly a century, the United States signed 368 different treaties with tribal nations. It created this massive, highly detailed paper trail. We're talking about the spreadsheets and paperwork of the 1800s here. But when you look at the historical record, this mountain of documents really just served as the facade of justice, covering up what was effectively an imperial conquest. Which leads us to a highly unique conflict down in the Deep South during the era of the Cotton Kingdom. While this systematic displacement was happening all across the frontier, there was a deeply entrenched hurdle in the South. The South was home to 5 large, established nations: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. They were collectively referred to at the time as the 5 civilized tribes, and their situation was totally distinct. They'd lived side by side with European settlers for a long time. They had formally recognized treaties. They'd even adopted a lot of European customs. Many spoke English, practiced European-style farming, wore European clothing, and yeah, some even participated in the institution of slavery. But here's the economic reality that threw a wrench into everything. Their homes sat directly on top of the Black Belt Prairie. This was a strip of incredibly fertile soil that was absolutely perfect for growing cotton. And at this time, Southern farmers were getting insanely wealthy off this cash crop, fueled entirely by the labor of enslaved Africans. So, hungry to expand their lucrative cotton empires, these settlers aggressively targeted this highly valuable, formally acknowledged tribal real estate. And this is where things get wild, and the Supreme Court gets entirely ignored. To clear out this valuable cotton land, the state of Georgia literally passes a law trying to abolish the Cherokee government. But the Cherokee didn't just roll over. They fought back using the U.S. legal system, and they took their case all the way to the Supreme Court. And guess what? They won. The judicial branch affirmed that the Cherokee had ironclad, documented rights to their home, ruling that states like Georgia absolutely could not impose on tribal sovereignty. Legally speaking, the tribes won the fight. Now, what's truly remarkable here is how fast George Washington's old ideals of justice went out the window. A Supreme Court ruling requires the executive branch to actually enforce it. But the executive branch was run by President Andrew Jackson, a guy who thought negotiating with Native Americans was a joke. Jackson bluntly ignored the highest court in the land because it didn't fit his expansion agenda, famously dropping this quote, challenging Chief Justice John Marshall to enforce the ruling himself. So, with the president refusing to do his job, we get the infamous Indian Removal Act. Without the executive branch enforcing the court's ruling, the legal protection for the tribes just vanished. The government simply shifted strategies. They legalized the land grab on a federal level with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Andrew Jackson pushed this through Congress, using taxpayer dollars to fund the relocation of First Americans out of the East and into the Great Plains, which back then was considered basically an inhospitable dumping ground. And the craziest part of this legislation is the absolute charade it maintained. It claimed negotiations had to be fair and voluntary, but in practice, that just meant relying on treaties signed by completely unauthorized individuals acting as fake tribal leaders just to get the signatures needed to make it look strictly legal on paper. As a result of that paperwork, the scale of displacement was massive. 100,000. That is how many people the U.S. government and military expelled from the 5 tribes between 1831 and 1838. Once the neat and tidy paperwork was signed, the reality on the ground was horrific. Tens of thousands of people were bound in chains and herded west at gunpoint on a deadly 1,000-mile forced march known as the Trail of Tears. Through brutal weather and treacherous terrain, an estimated 3,000 to 15,000 Native Americans died along the way. All of this literally to empty out the land so the booming cotton economy could move in. Look, this entire history shatters the myth of some chaotic, undocumented Wild West frontier. This wasn't an accident. It was a highly systemic, heavily documented process enshrined right into the law. It was managed with the spreadsheets and the receipts of the 1800s. It was effectively the first state-sponsored ethnic cleansing, and it set a bureaucratic precedent so dark that dictators a century later, including in Europe, would literally study and cite this exact legal framework as inspiration for their own campaigns of displacement. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this to consider. We've looked at the paper trail. We've seen the Supreme Court rulings get ignored and the legislative acts get manipulated. When a country's foundational real estate is acquired and built through a meticulously documented trail of pretense, broken treaties, and bypassed laws, how should we view the legitimacy and the legacy of the borders we live within today? It is a heavy question, for sure, but understanding the actual bureaucratic mechanics of how the map was drawn, that's the first step to answering it.